Welcome to another episode of the podcast. This week we have Elizabeth Knight. She is a nurse practitioner and health coach, and I'm happy to have her here to talk about some general things about health. And specifically, we're going to dive into sleep today. So, Elizabeth, happy to have you. How did you get into doing what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here, Will. Thanks for having me. So, like you said, I'm a nurse practitioner, a family nurse practitioner, so primary care. And I also am a health coach who works specifically with runners and other sort of everyday athletes. And what that means, a lot of people aren't familiar with what health coaching means, is that I help people sort of take a 10,000 foot view of their health overall, different areas of their health, and what their specific personal sort of goals and values are around health, and then help them work on making specific goals and plans to support those things. And that tends to include things like focusing on sleep, on nutrition, on sometimes it is their running goals and doing more specific run coaching, but other things surrounding that, like other types of exercise and movement. And then things like their relationships and their stress management
Sure.
and how all of those things come together. Yeah.
Awesome. How did you get started into that? And yeah, how did you get started in the health coaching world?
Yeah, so I have, like I said, been working in primary care for a number of years. And during the early pandemic, I was finding that I really needed to find a different approach to working with people in the health space. It just became, I think, a lot for me to try to sort of envision everything in this sort of crisis mode, respond, disease focus. And, I still work in that setting part-time, but to have a space where I really get to work with individual people on making positive changes and positive goals, as opposed to just responding to the sort of terrible things that are happening to them, it feels like a really different way of approaching health and healthcare. So it's not just that kind of illness care, sick care, disease care model that we get trained in as healthcare providers. And it's just such a positive thing. And I think that a lot of people really need that and they really value it. And working in that space has been just really rewarding for me. And also because I'm a runner and an athlete myself, sort of being able to share that with people in the context of, being a trusted advisor is a really nice place to be working.
That's awesome. Yeah, I know like a lot of people who listen to this probably know that I kind of got into the whole fitness and health space as a result of my dad dying many years, like 6 years ago. And like, yeah, watching that whole thing go down, I can tell you that, you know, nobody needs to be a part of that longer than they need to. So I can definitely see why you'd want to step away from that and do some of your own stuff from the actual like healthcare perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a really nice way to balance those things, to be able to, use my expertise in that more disease space when it's necessary, but also to be able to bring all of that experience that I have in managing illness into managing health, and really working that way. And it's been a great transition for me to be able to do both.
That's awesome. How did you get into running?
Yeah, I actually took up running when I was in nursing school. And, I think a lot of people don't really realize how challenging nursing school is. It's a ton of science, right? You do
Oh yeah,
biochemistry, you do,
it's brutal.
yeah, it's a lot. It's science, it's math. And then it's also just this intense human focus of it. And I think, being young and also being in this intense academic setting, and then on top of that, being in a clinical setting, which you do in nursing school, you do clinical rotations, and you're dealing with sick people, and you're dealing just with sort of the entire breadth of humanity, and that's a lot to sort of learn and adapt to. And like the first time you see somebody who's really sick and really suffering, and you're touching that person and you're in the room with that person, it takes a lot of processing and a lot of growth. And anybody who is, a dedicated runner knows the healing power of spending some time out on the road or the trail just by yourself, and sort of letting your brain catch up and process. And so I started running at that time in my life, really to fill that space. And then I took it with me through graduate school when I did my nurse practitioner training, and I eventually got my research doctorate in nursing as well. And just having that outlet was wonderful. And then I got into it, I think, even deeper in the past few years. It's when I started working with a coach, and I did my first ultra last year. And I think coming through the pandemic, like I was talking about earlier, and sort of switching out of being in, healthcare system mode and into this sort of new space of working, in health and working in fitness and working in, this glorious space where people are doing the things they want to be doing. It just sort of took off for me, and I've been, really entrenched in this space since then.
That's awesome. Which ultra do you end up doing?
I did the Perpetua Coast 50K out in Oregon. It was a wonderful race. Yeah, it's beautiful race, 50K, a lot of ups and downs, but these incredible sort of sweeping views of the coastline, and then these incredible forest trails. And yeah, it was really I don't even know if I have words for it. It's that great thing about trail running, right? Which is that you're working so hard but it's so beautiful that you almost forget that you're suffering.
I feel like that's a perfect description of how that goes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Well, I wanted to ask first before we get into like all the sleep stuff. I see that you often, like in multiple of your platforms, you label yourself as like an evidence-based practitioner, right? And I come largely from like the nutrition space. That's where I kind of started out. And there you see so many evidence-based people who are still feeding, I don't know if I'd call them lying, but many of them are still lying. And like you have some people like Saladino with the carnivore diet, and then there's like Gregor with the vegan troop, and they both have published books with like hundreds of citations. I think there's like over 300 in Paul's and 600 in Gregor's. And like, I don't actually need you to call out either of them because I'll do that plenty on my own. But I do want to ask, like, how the hell do we know who's being honest and who's just like feeding a bunch of bullshit in the space? How do we separate the people like that from like the Lane Nortons who are pushing out as much citation without, but like actually well-intentioned?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked me that, Will, because this is an area that I'm really passionate about, is talking about science and evidence and how these things can be used appropriately and how they can be used inappropriately. And so just a little bit of background about me. So I have a PhD in nursing science. So I am trained, in the research world. And when we do academic work and write academic papers in that space, you review evidence in a way that's very specific. And that means you have to look at the totality of what's published on a topic. And that usually isn't sort of neat, right? It's very messy. There's usually all kinds of things all over the place. And there are studies that are designed in specific ways to show specific things. And, that's the way the study was sort of conceived of because the author wanted to find a particular outcome, and that can happen. And that can happen in an individual study. And that doesn't mean that the study doesn't show that or that the author is lying, but it means usually that it's a very specific way that something was tested in a very specific context, in a very specific group of people with a very specific outcome that they measured. And they may come to certain conclusions about that are correct or incorrect in a broader sense, but either way, it's one study. And any study can probably find anything, right? And if you want to look for the true sort of answers from science, I think the first thing is that you have to take a much broader lens and look not at any individual study, but at all of what's out there and look for trends in that. And a great way to do that, if you're a consumer and not a scientist, where you maybe can't understand the specific difference in study design that's going to show you this or that and what statistical analysis was done in which particular order, look for a systematic review. And that term systematic implies that this process was done where the authors searched through all the existing evidence on a topic, and they used a specific protocol to do that. So they're not doing, what would be considered that cherry picking of like, look, see, I found a study that proves my point. And instead
Yeah.
they're saying, what does the overall body of literature show? So that's one really sort of important thing to do. And then I think another thing is that if even just you're reading sort of in like a newspaper or a popular book, scientists who are really ethical and truly interested in truth seeking will very rarely make these bold and concrete statements. This is the absolute truth about something. They'll say, well, it appears from the existing evidence that it's most likely that. And that type of thing isn't weaseling, right? It's saying this is as much certainty as we can generate with the techniques that we have, scientifically speaking. And so when I say that I practice based on evidence, I will look at a variety of research on a particular topic, and I'll look for those systematic reviews, and I'll look for the sort of the totality of evidence on something. And that sometimes means that what I do isn't necessarily the most like quote cutting edge. Right. So a study came out last week that shows, that, in diabetic mice, using a 0.5 gram of this particular compound will change their blood sugar and they lived 12 minutes longer. So I'm going to prescribe that to all my patients. And, there are people who sort of practice that way. And
Oh, yeah.
I just made that up. It's ridiculous, but it's not that ridiculous.
It's not that far off, though.
Yeah.
That's kind of the problem.
Yeah. And so I will oftentimes sort of wait and see, what is going to come out across this as we see it in more situations that are more relevant to the actual practice of what I'm doing and the types of people I'm working with and the situations they're working in. So it's kind of a high level discussion of evidence and what that means. But so yes, when you see those authors who have an agenda, right? And then they go back and they say, well, let me find studies that are going to support this agenda. That's a really, really different approach from saying, I want to put out everything that I can find on this topic and see, what buckets that evidence falls into. And that's the more scientific evidence-based approach from my perspective.
Absolutely. And I think like you often end up in this issue with like two different things about human personality coming into conflict here, where the more you know about a topic, like the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? So the more you know about the topic, often the more wishy-washy you sound about it, because the more you learn about it, you end up with realizing the less you know. It's like in the totality of evidence. Whereas like as humans, we love certainty. So this person out there who knows nothing, except like one thing, and is willing to push that as hard as he or she can, ends up being very trusted because he sounds very certain, and yet the person who actually knows a bunch ends up sounding like he doesn't know anything, because it's like every question requires a 30-minute response because it's so complicated.
Yeah. I say this all the time, and it is sort of a running joke about it, but the most common answer I give to any question is it depends.
Every coach in the world who's worth their salt, right? Like it's totally true.
Yeah, and that comes from a place of being humble about the limits of the knowledge that we have, which again I think is the mark of a really ethical practitioner or scientist.
Great. Well, we'll move forward so I don't like bore everybody to death, but I appreciate that you like take that perspective, and I think it's a really important thing to do. So let's talk a little bit about sleep, because I don't know, I talk about it intermittently, but we haven't had a dedicated episode to this in a while. So sleep. Why does sleep matter? Not just in general, but also to us specifically as athletes and as runners.
Yeah, it's right there in the title, right? Well, sleep great. And I love this one because I just love that you have it in there, because to me, in my dual roles as a primary care provider and as a coach for athletes, I see sleep as basically the master switch. And I think it's really undervalued. But when somebody comes to me, really in either context, and they're feeling lousy or they're wanting to make progress, this is oftentimes the first thing that I say, well, let's look at your sleep, because it can tell us so much about what's going on with that person. So, I prescribe exercise for sleep problems, and I prescribe sleep for exercise problems, right? And so I think these two work really, really well together. It's also, just this broad, if there's a panacea, I think it's sleep. It helps mental health, it helps physical health, and it feels good, right? Which not everything that's helpful for our health feels good, but sleep does. And then, just broadly, I won't go into, hours of scientific evidence about sleep because, we don't have all day, but I could. And if
Yeah.
you're interested in that, so, send me a message and I'll give you the lowdown. But for athletes in particular, we know that loss of sleep is associated with increased perception of effort. So if you are underslept, everything feels harder. And so that means that your training isn't going to be as effective, and it means that your racing isn't going to be as effective. Also, decreased sleep is just plain old associated with injury. And, we don't know whether that's for a particular reason. All of the mechanisms haven't necessarily been spelled out in clear research studies, but there's lots of reasons why that might be, right? If you're experiencing lack of sleep, your coordination isn't what it ought to be. And so that's one way that you could have injury. And then the other one, which I think is really important, is that muscle and tissue repair happens during sleep. And so if those things aren't happening as the way they're supposed to, your risk of injury would go up, hypothetically, theoretically. And so that's another mechanism that potentially explains that effect that we've seen.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you have a bunch of people trying to hack their food to produce like slightly more whatever growth hormone, and yet you're getting 4 hours of sleep a night, so you can't produce growth hormone, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. So growth hormone is a great example. Growth hormone and testosterone, they're steroid hormones that the body makes, are synthesized and released during deep sleep or slow wave sleep, which is that stage 3 and 4 sleep at, late in the sleep cycle. And those are things that people use in synthetic illegal forms to enhance their performance, right? And so your body makes those things for you if you sleep appropriately. And so, why would you go through all of this trouble of doing illegal and dangerous things to get those substances into your body when all you need to do is sleep better and it will happen? So that means that you need both enough sleep and you need high quality sleep, because to get into that slow wave sleep, you can't just be dozing off here and there. You have to be, attending to sleeping in a really quality way. And if you do that, you'll really reap the benefits. And so that's, the one way that the athlete really benefits from high quality sleep.
That makes a ton of sense. And yeah, I feel like we could push hormones forever, and yet if you're not like actually getting the sleep to help you utilize them, it doesn't make any sense. It's just not going to do its job.
Yeah, so that's kind of a workaround.
100%. And like it's just not sustainable. So on that note, like how much sleep do people need in order to be successful in what they're trying to do?
Okay, ready? It depends.
Always.
So, a good baseline for an otherwise healthy adult is somewhere between 7 and 9 hours of sleep a night. That doesn't mean that that's right for everybody. And that's also a really wide window. And I would say that for athletes, especially for athletes who are training hard, so, your trail and ultra athletes who, like you and me and the people who are probably listening to this podcast, probably need more on that end rather than less. And as you go through a training cycle, if you're, peaking at a higher mileage, if you're adding more stress, more hours of training, your sleep needs will go up as well. But I would say for most people, you can use that as a general guideline, but then you need to just pay attention to yourself and the feedback that you get from your body. And the best way to tell, hey, how am I doing on sleep, is how do you feel when you wake up in the morning? And if you wake up in the morning and you're like, oh, I could sleep for 2 more hours, you might need 2 more hours of sleep. But if you wake up in the morning and you feel good consistently and you're feeling alert throughout the day and you're not feeling groggy and you're feeling like you're generally able to stay awake and function well, that's a good measure that you're probably getting a good amount of sleep. But you do have to pay deliberate attention to that, because I think a lot of people are going through chronically underslept and they've just gotten used to it. And that's not the same thing as actually having a sufficient amount of sleep for you. So it takes that sort of moment of honesty with yourself and to say, like, how do I actually feel? And if you're not sure, if you think you might be getting enough, but you're not sure, I would suggest try bumping it up a little at a time, like even, 15 minutes at a time. time and see. And rather than saying, how little sleep can I get away with, try saying, if I add a little bit, how does that go? And that's a hard shift to make for a lot of people, right? Because you have to make some trade-offs for that. Most of us don't have an extra hour sitting around that we're like, well, let's just use that on sleep, right? It would be, you have to give up something else to give yourself extra sleep. But I think that's a really powerful strategy for some people, is to say, well, let's try adding more sleep until I think I've gotten to the best I can be, instead of saying like, no, I think I'm fine.
Absolutely. And I mean, I feel like you're often as in like the general you are often the first person you're going to lie to. You're going to lie to yourself first, right? Because like you have people out there like Jocko Willink who needs less. There's a very few like subset of genetic freaks who need less sleep. And then there's also like, I mean, LeBron James sleeps like 10 hours a night or something like that. And I think the fact that we are often like the fact that there are these examples out there of people who don't quite need as much leads some of us to like, we're fine. Whereas like, and I was one of those people for a decade and a half, right? Like I got about an average of 5 hours a night, and it thought I was okay. And like, if I was honest, I was tired all the time. And like, once I started playing with it more, I need more like 7 and change. And that's kind of my sweet spot. And I think if more people took the time to do what you said, like slowly add some more and see where they actually fall on the rested scale, they might learn that they've been not fully honest with themselves for the better part of years.
Yeah. Do you feel better now that you're sleeping more?
Yeah, definitely. Like not even a question. I have tried the like 8 to 9 hours though, and I feel groggy on the other end. So like that seems to be too much to me, but like somewhere around the 7 mark, I'm much better than when I was at 5. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And that's a great point, is that there's usually a sweet spot, right? And there is such thing as too much, and there's such thing as too little, but you won't find those boundaries if you don't try.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, something that I say all the time in my coaching practice is that you have to approach yourself with curiosity and not with judgment, to say, I wonder what would happen if I slept for 8 hours instead of 7 hours, instead of saying like, nope, I can't do it. I don't need to, I'm fine. It's like, where does that come from? That comes from this sort of cultural pressure of like, hustle, I'll sleep when I'm dead. I've got other stuff to do. And, when it comes down to it, that's not necessarily serving you. And if you say, well, what if, give it a try. I think that's new though, because it requires this mindset shift, right? It requires a shift aside from what can I get away with to what would be the best thing for me. And that's hard, right? It requires focusing on yourself in a way that we might have been sort of conditioned to believe is selfish or lazy, or all of these other sort of judgment words that are not helpful.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think the curiosity, not judgment, is one of the most important things people can do. That's really all you can do. You're constantly an experiment of one, and you just got to figure it out. It's always this pursuit towards growth.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, we don't know what's going to help us necessarily unless we try. And we can go back to evidence and say there are certain things that appear to be largely helpful for most people. And if you don't try it on yourself, though, you won't know if it's going to help you or not. And so,
100%.
in coaching, and I'm sure this is in your coaching practice as well, a lot of what we have to do isn't to tell people like, well, here's the answer of what you need to do. It's to say, you already know that, right? You already know what a good step for you might be. And it's to say, how do we start taking those steps in that direction and see how it works for us?
Very, very true. So if we're looking at what might be a good first step for someone to take to start to modify or adjust their sleep schedule, like what would that be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say for people who are struggling with sleep, a good way to think about it is in 3 categories. And I like to think about this as there's body noise, and there's brain noise, and there's bed noise, right? And those are the 3 kinds of things that can be bothering us. And so I think starting with your body is a great place for most people. And so this is like, are there things sensations in your body or medical issues that are interfering with your ability to sleep. And this is before we get worried about, all of the behavioral stuff around, what's going on with your schedule. It's like, let's just start with the basics there. And sometimes this means you just need a quick medical screening, right? There are definitely medical things that can be involved in this. It's very, very common to have sleep apnea. That can interfere with sleep, or something like restless leg syndrome can interfere with sleep. There are medications that interfere with sleep, and they're not necessarily things that you might think of. Like, we know that, for instance, stimulant medications that people might take for ADHD, or like Sudafed, those are stimulant type of medications that can interfere with sleep. But so can some other things that you might not think about. Beta blockers, or like diuretics that you might be taking for blood pressure for other reasons can interfere with your sleep, things like that. So if you haven't had a visit with a medical professional and talked about this, that might be a place to start if sleep is something that you struggle with. Pain can also be a huge issue for people. If you have chronic pain, if you have musculoskeletal pain that's keeping you up at night, that sometimes getting that addressed can really improve your sleep. So I don't skip over that piece. If sleep is a struggle for you, of saying like, what's going on in my body that we might be able to improve.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think we've all probably been there after a fall or a tweak. Like, it can be tough to fall asleep if your knee's in pain. So if there's like even smaller stuff that's twinging at you, then that you don't even notice anymore, of course it might be affecting your sleep.
Yeah. So take care of those things. And usually those body noise things are reasonably fixable, right? Or at least they can be identified and you can get a plan for that. So that would be something to do. The next category, I think, is a little bit harder. And this is what I would call the brain noise category. So people who ruminate, right? You're waking up at 2 a.m. and you're like, oh, I have a work thing and it's stressing me out and I can't let it go, or whatever else it is for you. And that can really disrupt sleep for people as well. And so I think the first step to fixing that one is just identifying like, oh, is that me? Am I doing that?
I think you probably have a lot of people listening to this who might be in that category, considering a lot of ultra runners are a little type A, and if they tend to ruminate, I'm one of them. So yeah, I feel
Yeah. And so, there's not a quick fix for that issue necessarily, but one tool that helps a lot of people is to sort of do the bedtime brain dump, where you can, just keep yourself a journal or a notepad or something like that. And when it's time to wind down, sort of write down the things that you're worried about, write down the things that you don't want to forget, write down the thing that's going to wake you up at 2 a.m. because you're like, oh my God, did I forget to, whatever it is for the next day. And that's one. And then another one that can really help with that brain noise piece is establishing some type of mindfulness or stress reduction practice during the daytime. And so even if you're like, no, that's not for me, that's like wishy-washy, hippy-dippy stuff, like, try it out and see if you can maybe find like a 5-minute mindfulness practice, because what that does is it teaches you to tone your parasympathetic nervous system. And that's the rest and digest part of your nervous system. And if you can practice using that, just like you can train your muscles in your strength training, right? You can tone your parasympathetic nervous system, and then you'll be able to access it when you need it and you're trying to relax again. So that might be another way that you could work on that brain noise piece.
Absolutely helpful. And I'll say that I think like the word meditation kind of throws people into a bit of a funk because there's so much years of stuff associated with it. But I heard it described recently that we should probably reframe meditation as a practice of refocusing. Like, I think a lot of people feel like they fail at meditation because they can't clear their brain. And that's not the point. The point is that you're not going to clear your brain, and you're constantly practicing on that like refocusing center. And that is actually like the whole purpose of it. And if you can spend like 3 minutes doing that in your day, great. Or like take a deep breath. It can help a lot.
Yeah, I love that, refocusing. And I think another way to think about that, if the sort of meditation doesn't sound good, is think about a breathing practice or a breathwork practice. That's a very powerful tool for the nervous system as well. And it's also, part of a lot of meditation traditions, but it doesn't have to be sort of thought of as meditation. Even just practicing some of those techniques, like a box breathing or a 4-7-8 breath or things like that, can be a very helpful tool.
It only takes like 2 minutes before 7-8 for it to work, right? Like, it doesn't, it's not a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
And if you're not familiar with that one, you can just Google it. There's some great videos about it, 4-7-8 breath. And it's really a wonderful tool that you can do in just a few minutes. And you can almost feel the effects of it in your body really quickly if you get used to how to do it.
Well, just writing a note to make sure to include that, a link to that in the show notes. Awesome.
Yeah,
So
great.
thanks. I think that's a great idea. What else do we have?
Yeah, the last one on the sort of taxonomy here would be bed noise. And that's what I think of as environment stuff. So what's going on in your space that might be disrupting your sleep? And so that's, is it dark in your room? Do you have, blinking lights in there? Is it hard to make it dark because you're sleeping in the daytime? Maybe you're a shift worker. Is it too warm or too cool in your room? Is it hard for you to get still because you have a dog in your bed? Whatever it is that might make it hard to feel sort of comfortable and restful in your environment, that you might want to think about making some tweaks there. And a really big one in this category, and I'm so sorry because nobody likes to hear this, is don't bring your phone to bed with you. There's two
Yeah.
reasons for that, right? And one is the blue light from the screens is disruptive to sleep. We know that from scientific studies about the effects of blue light in your eyes and your sleep and your brain. But you can't fix that by using night shift mode or wearing those glasses. You just can't. It's still there. But even beyond the light exposure, it's the mental stimulation. Nothing you're doing on your phone in bed at night is calming you down, I promise, right? You're scrolling through Instagram, you're scrolling through the news, you're watching videos, you're checking your email. Like none of that is sending the signal to your body and your brain, like it's time to sleep, right? It's saying like, ooh, what's over here? Ooh, shiny, like, ooh, we got to do this tomorrow. And none of that is conducive to sleep. So please put your phone to bed. Figure out how to do that. That's a really hard one for people. And I say a lot of times when you're trying to pick, what's the right step for me to work on first, the one that sounds like, oh, I could never do that, or I don't think that would be important for me. Usually that's the one that would like flip the switch for you and you're resisting it
Yeah.
for some reason because you don't want to give it up. And if you go back to that curiosity piece, you would say, well, what would happen if, or why am I feeling so strongly about this? And you're able to sort of answer yourself with honesty about that, you might make some progress.
Very true. And I would say, like, if somebody's not willing to even if you're not willing to rip off the band-aid, like even something is putting your phone in do not disturb so nobody can message you, or like deleting certain apps from your phone that like push that dopamine cycle, like it's not ideal, but let's not make perfect the opposite or the enemy of the good, right? So like your phone is probably a problem if you're not putting it to sleep. So let's make it a little bit better. And if that improves the issue, then maybe you need to get rid of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, that brings up my next point, which I think is really important for a lot of people, which is if that improves the issue. And I think what you need to do in order to understand, did this change that I made improve my sleep, is you need some way of keeping track of your sleep while you're trying to improve it and make changes. So runners are great at tracking things, right? We love all of our data. We have our whole training log. We know exactly our splits for everything. And we don't really necessarily apply that to other areas as well as we do to our running. And I'm not saying you have to track your sleep like, with one of those sleep devices. It will tell you exactly how much time it thinks you were in slow wave sleep and all of this. It can be much, much simpler than that. But if you don't keep track at all, then it's going to be hard for you to see, are you making progress from one of the little changes that you make? And so what I would recommend is you can just do this like on a piece of paper, right? Or a notebook, or use a training log, add a column to your training log that you use for running. Or like in my practice, I use a sleep tracker, or a holistic training log that's got a column for sleep. And, I have versions of those things that I use with my clients. And if you want to use those, you can find them on my website. They're free, but it doesn't really matter what you use as long as you have some way of saying, how did I do with sleep? Because especially with sleep, every night of sleep will not be perfect, right? Even if you do everything right? You put your phone to bed at 8 o'clock and you get a same time every day, you go to bed at the same time every day, you quit caffeine, you know, all of the things, and you're like, I did everything perfect, you will still have nights where your sleep sucks. And that's okay, right? A single night of terrible sleep is not going to destroy you. But because it's not so one-to-one, you know, behavior and then outcome, you need to track it over time to really see the benefits and see the changes. And so if you're working on, say, making your bedtime 15 minutes earlier, and you track that over like 2 or 3 weeks, you'll have a better sense of how did you sleep, how did you feel, how did you perform, than if you do it for 2 nights and say, well, that sucked, you know? So I really recommend trying to track your sleep. In quality improvement in healthcare, one of the things that we do when we set up a project is to say, how will I know that a change resulted in an improvement? And this is one way that I recommend that you do that when you're trying to make changes in your sleep.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Like there's 2 things I kind of wanted to touch on in that. So one would be tracking sleep, right? Like I wear an Oura ring. I got it because I was like working night shift and I wanted, you know, the impetus to do better. So like, how accurate and are these devices that track sleep? And like what you mentioned some of the positives. Is there a downside to tracking sleep sometimes? Like I've heard Inigo Semnalan, who is like a Tour de France coach, and he's been on Peter Attia's podcast a couple times. He uses HRV trackers, he uses sleep trackers with these world-class athletes, but he definitely doesn't use them like during the tour or like even the week prior, because he's like, the last thing I need is this dude to know that he slept badly. So like how can we use these to be most effective and not get in our own head?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the technology in these devices varies. Some of them, they use combinations of like accelerometers that show your movement. Some of them use a pulse oximeter to look at your blood oxygen level. They look at heart rate variability, like you mentioned, HRV. Some of them use temperature. And so they have a variety of inputs. And then every device is a little bit different, whether it's Aura or Whoop or, you know, what's on your Garmin. You know, there's lots of them out there now. And they all have an algorithm in which they feed the data points that they can collect from the technology that you're wearing on your finger or your wrist or wherever it is. And then they come up with some type of score, right? And they're using data points to make assumptions. And that's, you know, that's fine. And some of them are probably more accurate than others. And none of them, though, are medical information, right? So I think it's important to remember that
Yes.
it's not the same thing as a sleep study. So if you are actually experiencing like sleep difficulties beyond, you know, a little bit of disruption in sleep here and there, and it's something that's more significant than that, then this is not a substitute for going to a sleep lab and getting a polysomnography test. Or they have some that are home-based now, but still they're using medical equipment. So it's not medical equipment, right? It's consumer equipment, and it's fun.
Yeah,
It's for fun.
true.
And the best way to look at that data is to look at larger trends over time and not to focus on any single day, because both any single day of sleep can be a disaster, and that doesn't really mean anything. But also those devices can malfunction. They can have been, you know, in a funny position and the data is like wonky. And so if the data looks like totally wrong, it might be. And so I wouldn't ever get too obsessed about that. And then you also have to know yourself, right? Some people love data and they're really good at looking at it and saying like, oh, that's interesting. And some people are very obsessive about it. And they say, okay, I have to optimize this score. This score exists, so it has to be perfect. And you have to know that about yourself, right? If you're the type of person who can't let it go, if your numbers aren't what you want them to be, then you might find that it's counterproductive to use a device like that. But if you're a person who really just is like, let's look at all of the inputs and put them all in sort of a big bowl here and look at all of the data together and use the data from my Oura Ring, you know, as one input in this whole, you know, array of information that also includes things like, how did I feel, right? You know, what was my perception of effort? How awake did I feel? You know, what was my mental clarity like? That kind of subjective data that your device is never going to be able to give you, and look at it all together. And I think that's really helpful. And just like with people who maybe struggle on the run with being too data focused on their watch, something that I might suggest is, okay, we'll wear it, but like hide it under your sleeve and don't look at it until later. And then you can look at your data sort of in a more trending way. I would recommend the same thing for people who maybe want the sleep data, but struggle with being a little bit too obsessed about it, is like collect it and then look at it all together, as a broader trend later on, instead of trying to micromanage any individual data point over like one day.
Absolutely. I would also say that the like general aggregate assessors of these devices tend to be terrible. So like the most useful thing I've found from this is like temperature is really helpful. Like actual individual metrics of HRV is really helpful. The sleep score it gives me is garbage, like every day. It has no correlation with how I feel. And I've done this for years. But like the temperature is a pretty good indicator if I slept poorly or if I like ate too close to bed. If my heart rate drops really late in the night, it means I ate too close to bed. Like these things tend to be helpful. And I'd say the same thing about your run. Like when your Garmin tells you you had an unproductive run, half the time it's bullshit. We know
Yeah, it's like, screw you, Garmin.
Yeah, exactly. It's a liar because it usually meant you just did a really good zone 2 run for like 2 hours and it was solid, but it's going to tell you it's unproductive because it wants you to race every single training session. So
yeah. I think it's just so important to remember that those things they're computers, right? They're machines. They're programmed, with a particular algorithm, and they're not smart. Like they don't actually know anything, right? You put numbers into them, and there's a calculation that goes on, and they spit out an answer. And so it doesn't take all of the data into account. It just takes the things that it can measure. And I think actually people probably would be oftentimes surprised at how little data goes into those things compared to the claims of what they spit out. What actually gets measured is usually a very small amount of information.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, like just to use the Garmin as a very easy example, because I'm sure pretty much everybody who's listening to this has used some version of that. Like Garmin doesn't know your actual VO2 max, largely because you probably haven't done that many VO2 max workouts with it. Like one, it can't anyway, because you don't have a mask strapped to your face. And then two, like most runners aren't doing that on a regular basis unless you're like in a VO2 training cycle. So it just has no idea. It's only as good as the data you're giving it, and you're not giving it the right kind of data most of the time. So it's absurd. Yeah.
That's right. When I first got a Garmin that told me my VO2 max, I laughed. I was like, what?
I don't even know what mine is on my Garmin because I just know it's useless. Yeah,
it's silly. But again, the devices can be super useful, and they can be useful at trending over time. And one thing they can be very useful for is teaching us the correlations between behaviors that we might have and things that might change in our physiology. And
absolutely.
So you can definitely use devices like that for that, and that's really helpful. Like I've seen people use the devices that measure HRV and say like, oh, you know what? When I drink alcohol, my HRV tanks, and that might be a useful piece of information. Not necessarily because of what your actual sleep score was in the morning, but because it taught you to recognize a correlation that you might not have seen otherwise. Or you might have been back in that bucket of, I don't want to know this. I don't want to know this. Don't tell me because I'm attached to this behavior. And then you can see like, oh, I actually can't deny that when I do this, it shows me that. And so it can be really useful in that way.
Yeah, like, I mean, I just use myself as a quick example. Like two things that I've definitely learned is one is caffeine. Like I thought for years that I wasn't affected by caffeine in regards to sleep. And then as soon as I start to take data, like if I drink it within like 8 hours of bedtime, my REM sleep tanks. One. Two, if I eat too close to bed, my heart rate drops like really late in the night instead of earlier. So these are things that I didn't think were a big deal for over a decade and absolutely affect me from a like recovery standpoint. So these are the kind of things that you can really learn from these tools.
Yeah, exactly. And those are all great examples actually of things to consider tweaking when you're looking at your sleep as well. So I always talk about doing a substance reset, and that includes alcohol, it includes caffeine, it includes sometimes medications that you might be taking. Never like stop taking your medications without talking to your healthcare provider, but sometimes you can adjust the time of day that you take them, or your dosage need adjusting. And then, other things that are substances that can change sleep architecture. are things that our body makes. And like one of those big ones is adrenaline, right? So if you're like one of those people who likes to watch scary movies late at night before bed, you might actually find that you're experiencing a physiological effect from that adrenaline in your body late at night. And so, that's another way that that substance might be affecting your sleep architecture. And you mentioned, that your REM sleep was affected. And REM sleep is something that we know is affected with alcohol use. And so that's a really important thing to consider. And so absolutely devices are great for showing you those types of things. Although you could do it without too, it just won't give you the same sort of specificity of information. Yeah. And if you just use a sleep log, you might also find like, I feel anxious and tired the day after I had coffee at 2 p.m. And what that might be telling you is that you didn't get enough REM sleep, right? It won't tell you that in the same way, but it will tell you the same outcome of information, right? Which is that this isn't good for me, and let's see what happens if I tweak it.
Absolutely. And that makes a ton of sense and tracks my personal experience really well. So if we look at, like, I love the substance reset idea. If we look at some things that we might need to look at, you mentioned alcohol, caffeine, adrenaline, like on the quick side note, the scary movie thing's amazing to me because I know that there's quite a few people that I've talked to that watching TV a little, like somewhat close to bedtime, not in bed, but somewhat close to bedtime, doesn't actually seem to bother them. They thought it did because they were watching like Game of Thrones. As soon as they started watching something like really calming, it completely went away. Yeah, you just need to like wind down. But other things that might affect, like what about food, marijuana, any of these things? Like how might these affect our sleep?
Yeah. So food, you mentioned like eating too close to bedtime can be something that has disrupted your sleep. And so that's a big one. I think that trying to have, especially if you're like one of those people who eats dinner as your larger meal of the day, to try to separate it from bedtime by a couple hours, if you can, because certainly the digestive process can be a little bit disruptive to getting into deep sleep. So that's another one. Marijuana, I think, is kind of a mixed bag. We don't have as much research on the effects of marijuana as we do of other substances like alcohol because of its legal status. And so, to look at actual like randomized controlled trials, there really aren't any. In some more epidemiological studies where they've collected data and people have reported their behavior or not. Again, it's kind of a mixed bag. Probably changes sleep architecture, meaning the way that you go through stages of sleep, including deep sleep and REM sleep, which serve different and important functions. But again, not as clear. And same thing with CBD or cannabidiol, which is like a hugely popular sleep supplement at the moment. There's not a ton of evidence one way or the other about that. People seem to feel that it's beneficial. We don't know, there's just not enough evidence for me to recommend for or against it.
Sorry, just laughing because like it's supposed to solve everything under the sun, and like it's just this is one of those examples of mixed quality data, let's call it that.
Yeah, fair. And I think that tends to fall like CBD tends to fall into that category of things that people are trying to do to hack their sleep.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I always like to say about hacks, like, bake your cake before you start decorating it, or like build your house before you pick out the wallpaper, right?
I really like those analogies a lot.
Not that those things are not nice. They can be great if you have the basics nailed, but nobody does. I have yet to meet somebody who has the basics nailed. And I've been doing this for a long time. Yeah. So I would say, start with those more basic things. Another really important sleep behavior is to try to be consistent with your bedtime and your wake time. And this is a struggle for people, and it includes weekends, right? Your body doesn't know that it's Saturday, right?
Yeah. You're ahead of me. That's exactly where I wanted to go next. Thank you.
Yeah. And so figuring out, how to make that work in your life is a step that I think is tricky for a lot of people. But if that's something that you struggle with, see if you can work on it. Give it a try. Try to stick to a routine. Figure out what that timing is going to be for you that works, and then try to stick with it. So I think that's another really good one to work on if that's you, if you're one of those people who's all over the place with your schedule.
Yeah. And this could this be another instance where like trying not to make the perfect the enemy of the good would be a good idea? Like if you have to wake up at 3:30 in the morning for work on work days and you want to have a mild social life so you don't have to go to bed at 8 p.m. on the weekend, like 6 is still better than 12. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I would say you don't ever need to be perfect about anything that you do, right? And go for the principle more than you go for like nailing the exact perfect thing every time. And I think, yes, because we are probably talking to a lot of type A endurance athletes, like don't let that become a stressor, right? Just try to stick to it in principle. And also, if you stray from it here and there, that's fine. Make it most of the time, and that will serve you really well. But yes, that's a really important one. Your body has a very strong drive to follow a circadian rhythm. And if you're all over the place, and then if you do that, you also tend to lean into other unhealthy habits, like you are maybe staying up late and you're drinking, and then you're using extra caffeine in the morning to combat it. And so it sort of spirals out of control into those other unhealthy habits.
Absolutely. I mean, so if we look at setting some of these habits, like what might be a good, like, I don't know, nighttime routine or morning routine or like setup that we could do to make this consistent?
I think the most important thing is to start where you are. Right. So take stock of what you're doing right now, of what your bedtimes and evenings look like right now. And don't try to like do a complete 180, because that doesn't work. Right. You might do it for 2 weeks and be like, well, that was cool. And then you slowly slip out of it because it doesn't fit your lifestyle for some reason. So I would say that would be my number one piece of advice, is take stock of where you are right now and then pick something to change. And it doesn't mean change everything, right? It means pick something that you think you can do and that you think is important, and start with that. So rather than like, what's the perfect like nighttime routine? Magazines love to do this. They're like, how does LeBron James get ready for bed? Or, you're like, I
Yes.
don't care. It doesn't affect my life. He's a professional athlete and like I'm me. So like, I need to
Yeah.
know, I know that I need to get up to get my run in before work at 5:30. So what I need to do is set up a routine that's going to allow me to do that. Right. And so I would say, what's the first step that I think I could take that might help me with that? And usually I don't have to tell somebody what that step is, right? They can figure it out for themselves in their own life. And then it's like, let's figure out how to do that one step. And so for a lot of people, that also involves like who else is involved in your life, in your day-to-day routine. So if you've got a partner, or you've got kids, or you've got some other structure with people around you, if your bedtime and morning routines are probably going to affect those other people, right? And
Yes.
so you need to bring people along with you on your journey, unless you're a single by yourself person with no other people who depend on you or are affected by you, and in which case do whatever you want. But and I want to know your secrets. But if that's not you, then get those people on board. And what I find is, if somebody really, really feels strongly that they want to get better and they want to make a change and they want to make a positive change, and they honestly and openly tell other people, like, here's what I want to do and here's why, the people who love them are like, sweet, let me help you. They're not like, what a drag. Right. So being open and honest about that and bringing people in, whether it's changing your sleep routines or any other thing that you're doing, like that's another sort of key piece of advice I have, is just be open and honest about it and bring people with you.
Yeah, it's so important. And I think it's not nearly discussed enough, especially when we're talking about keeping a consistent sleep schedule. Because like if you are on this schedule and that doesn't work for your partner or kids or whatever, like it is eventually going to fall apart. So
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
So
If you're trying to get into a bedtime routine too, and one of the things that might be helpful for you is trying to get to bed a little bit earlier, which is something that I hear from a lot of people a lot of times. You could try a tool like just auditing your time a little bit in the evenings, or really all day. But there's this sort of trendy thing where people are like, well, I'm going to go see how I spend my entire day in 15-minute increments, and that's kind of intense. But it does show you, when you say I don't have time for something that you actually maybe do, and you might be just apportioning your time in a way that you're not fully aware of. And so
Almost
a tool
always.
like that, yeah, can be helpful in freeing up the 15 minutes that you need. And you might find that you're taking it from, oh, that was my Facebook time, or that was my sit there and stare out the window and not do anything time. Or sometimes it's even that you steal 15 minutes from something else that you think is a good, healthy habit. Like if you're going out for a long run, you might be better served to cut your run by 15 minutes if that means that you're going to get 15 minutes more sleep. And again, it's individual and it doesn't translate one-to-one, but that's something that you might always want to consider is how am I spending that time and where can I find it?
100%. I mean, it is, I think most of us have more time than we think we do. And it's not to say you're not busy. Like I'm busy. A lot of people are busy. I train people who have like 6 kids and work a job and all these things. Like, but I don't know. I saw the schedule of someone. It was not Ariana Huffington, but it was someone like that who like gets literally 2,000 emails a day, answers most of them, runs an entire company, all these things. And like it was one of these like 15-minute breakdown things. I'm like, oh, I'm not busy. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
And she has
And it,
assistants and all this stuff. So like there's
mhm.
support and it's a whole different setup. But it's like if I actually took my day in 15-minute increments, there's a couple things I could cut if we're being honest.
Yeah, and it's not even a question of like you don't have to optimize every moment of your day, right?
Absolutely
But
not.
it's bringing that awareness of like where am I spending my time? And are the things that I believe I want to be prioritizing the things that I'm actually
That.
doing? And so
Yes.
yeah, finding that balance can be really helpful. And, it's another place where tracking like what am I doing with my time can give you information that you can then decide what to do with. And it's not to mean that you have to do this for the rest of your life, but it's to say that can give me the information that will help me to understand where I'm at. And when I
Yeah.
say start where you are, for a lot of people, figuring out where am I right now is the first step to what's the first change that I might like to make.
100%. Absolutely. I think it's just really easy. I mean, I don't even think it's people's faults. I think it's like really easy to end up in these like dopamine cycle traps where you pop on Facebook to see what's going on with your friends, and then suddenly it's been 45 minutes when you meant for it to take 20. So like that kind of stuff is really easy to fall into.
Yeah, it really is. And so, all of these areas wind up being connected, right? And if we say that time management is connected to sleep, is connected to stress management, is connected, and it is. And so we might find that the thing that you wanted to work on when you first came in and said, like, I need coaching, might have been something different. And then we wind up digging into how you're spending your time on Facebook, even though that on the surface might have very little to do with going to bed earlier, it in fact does. And so being sort of open to viewing your life and your changes and your priorities in that way can be such a powerful thing.
Absolutely. Speaking of time management, I just realized we've gone a little over an hour. I'm still good. Do you still have some time? Awesome. Okay. So a couple more questions. One I wanted to ask is about naps, the very mixed opinions on naps. They don't work very well for me, but I know they work very well for some people. What do we have on that?
Yeah, there's naps can be helpful for people who could use the extra sleep. And so oftentimes people who are training really hard can benefit from naps. We're actually going through a whole sleep cycle will sort of help you to jumpstart like that tissue repair process, the hormonal process. So yes, they can be helpful. Another thing is like just that kind of cat nap can be helpful. And there's data that suggests that like that 20-minute not reaching deep sleep can be very refreshing. It can boost alertness. It can boost sort of sense of well-being. What I would recommend if you want to try napping is don't do it close to bedtime. The best time for a nap is like 6 to 7 hours after you woke up. And so for a lot of people that like right after lunch would be a good time for a nap. That might be a little bit later than that, but that might be a great time to try to get it in. And you can just try it and see how it feels if you can do it. Not everybody has the luxury of time for a nap, but that cat nap is like a low risk thing, that 20-minute nap, especially if it's earlier in the day. And if you're a person who really could use some extra sleep, a longer nap in the early afternoon can be a good thing too. But some people like you find that it doesn't help them, that it makes them feel groggy, that they wake up feeling like hot garbage, in which case
Exactly.
get your sleep at night, right? And save that hour that you were going to nap, do something else during that time and go to bed an hour earlier.
Yeah, that's nailed it to a T. I always feel groggy and it just doesn't help. But I know for some people it's game changer. So
Yeah, and
cool.
lots of pro athletes nap, pro runners nap, especially like if you run doubles, that might be something that you want to consider between your morning and your afternoon session. If you have time for a short nap, that could be something that boosts adaptation, because taking it way back to the beginning, the adaptation doesn't happen when you're running, right? It happens in between, and so sleep definitely boosts adaptation.
For sure. So if we're looking also at like other things that, so the thing I really definitely want to ask you as a medical professional, like what about sleep aids? So be it our Ambiens or our melatonins or whatever, like what can we take away from these? Are they good? Are they causing issues? Are they causing us to pass out like alcohol and not actually making us sleep? Like what do these things do? And are they necessary and or helpful?
Yeah, so I think all of those things, they can be very helpful. So drugs like Ambien and Lunesta, they call them the Z drugs. They're non-benzodiazepine sleep drugs that are by prescription. They can help people in sort of acute circumstances where their sleep is disrupted. And that can be, there was like a trauma in your life, or maybe in travel or something like that, where regular sleep is not happening for some sort of time limited external reason. Or for some people who have like true sleep phase disorders, sometimes those things can be helpful as well, but they definitely alter normal sleep architecture. So the sleep that you get taking a sleep drug like that is not qualitatively the same as the sleep that you get from natural normal sleep. However, when we're comparing the outcomes, right? We're not comparing what would happen to you with healthy, natural, normal sleep versus taking a sleep drug. We're usually comparing what would happen to you with this insomnia that you're experiencing for whatever reason versus taking the sleep drug. And so in certain circumstances, those drugs can be really helpful because they're basically limiting the damage from insomnia. You're not getting perfect sleep when you're using them, but you're getting better sleep than you are if you're not sleeping at all. And so I would say use them, in conjunction with your medical professional in limited circumstances if you have an exit strategy, right? They're not meant to be like, oh, this is just how I sleep. I take an Ambien and then I get up in the morning. That's not like a great long-term strategy.
Understated thing. I think most of these should be, most things that we're taking like that should often be viewed as an exit strategy. And maybe you never actually make the exit, but it's at least a thing that we should be working towards, right? Like if they're a tool, they're not designed to be a crutch.
Yeah. And for most people, if you are experiencing that type of sleep disruption, there's something underlying it that we should try to address. And sometimes that's not true, right? There are some people who just have these pure primary sleep disorders, and those medications are the best tool that we have for them. But for most people, there's something else that needs to be addressed. And I think that the danger for people is when they use these medications is that they work, right? And that they then sort of stop you from addressing the underlying issue because you're like, oh, this works, I don't need to fix it anymore.
Yes.
So keep that in mind if you go that route. Again, not that you shouldn't, they can be really useful in the right circumstances as long as you're using them that way and not as like, this was the fix.
And 100%. And then what about the only hormone that we can buy over the counter, melatonin? Like how does that work? And is it addicted? All these things. Like what do we got for melatonin?
Yeah, so melatonin, your body makes melatonin, right? And the best evidence for using melatonin as a supplement is when you need to adjust the timing and cycle that you're sleeping on. And so for people who are maybe traveling time zones or doing shift work, and you need to give your body the signal of like, hey, lights out time, melatonin is useful in those circumstances. And that's where we have the best evidence for it, is for jet lag and for shift work. And the doses of melatonin that are useful in those circumstances are actually much, much lower than a lot of what's sold over the counter as melatonin supplements. Like we're talking like an order of magnitude different, like zero
Yeah.
0.3 milligrams, not 10 milligrams.
Yeah.
So again, melatonin is probably not harmful, even if you take a buttload of it, but it's probably also not doing a whole lot for you unless you're taking it in a sort of specific and directed way.
I used to take it for shift work, and I used to take like 5 milligrams at 2 p.m. every day. And like I did not at the time know that it was egregiously high. Absolutely.
Yeah, and again, like it's not like with other like medications where a dose like that is probably going to cause you difficulty, but it also just doesn't seem like it's necessary.
I mean, I can
And
tell
then
you it
there are
made me
some,
groggy, like really
yeah,
groggy. Like I'd wake
yeah.
up at 9 p.m. and just be, it was like a shot with a tranquilizer, right? So like that's mostly what I experienced from it.
Yeah. And again, you could try it and see how it works for you. And if you find that you get benefit from it, then great. It's not likely to be addictive. It's, anytime you're taking a hormone from outside of your body and putting it into your body, it has the potential to disrupt your body's normal production of that hormone.
Sure.
Because hormones work, the endocrine system works in feedback loops. That's how it regulates itself. And so you can mess with that when you're taking hormones externally. But with melatonin, that doesn't seem to be like at least a huge primary concern for most people. So it's generally considered to be pretty safe.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a bunch of sense and tracks with my experience as well. So I think that's most of what I had. I guess like the last thing I'd really like to ask before we start to close out are one, like what are some like very simple shifts or things you can do if you're struggling a little bit with sleep in order to start making these changes? And I guess, is it different if you're struggling to like fall asleep versus struggling to stay asleep?
Yeah, the biggest ones that I see work for people are to look at your caffeine and alcohol use. I think that people don't necessarily want to do that because we like those things. But give it a try, right? And see what happens. So alcohol at bedtime makes you sleepy, but it definitely disrupts your REM sleep. And so if you're a person who wakes up in the middle of the night, look at that, and I'm not saying you have to quit. I'm not saying you have to give it up, but see, does it have an impact on nights when you had a glass of wine, before bed? Do you wake up in the middle of the night? Right? Do you feel anxious in the morning? Is that related? And same thing with caffeine. So the people's ability to metabolize caffeine varies widely. There are people who legitimately can drink espresso after dinner and not have disrupted sleep. And I don't understand how that works, because if I touch anything with caffeine in it after noon, I'm like wired all day. But that's like, there's that inherent variability. And so you won't know which one you are unless you try it. You can order a fancy genetic test and pay a lot of money for that, and they'll tell you if you're a fast or a slow metabolizer, but you can find that out really easily just by trying it.
I would also say, like, just as someone who's been there, like, try it, even if you think it doesn't matter.
Yes.
It might.
Yes.
There are some people like Andrew Huberman's actually famously not affected by caffeine. He's one of those people who can have espresso. Like he's one of the people in the zeitgeist who is one of those people. I thought I was one of those people. Very wrong. So, yeah.
I'm so glad you said that. Well, try it even if you don't think it matters, even if you don't think it applies to you, because we love to hold on to the things that we really want to do because we've convinced ourselves that it doesn't matter. And so if it doesn't matter, then let it go for a little bit and see. Please try, even if you think it doesn't. The only thing you have to lose is like the couple of times that you didn't do the thing that you wanted to do. And if you're a runner, you can do hard things. So like do those hard things for a little bit and see.
Yeah. Like do it for a week.
Yeah, exactly. You can do that. I promise. And you come away with information, right? And then you can decide what to do with that information. And if you decide it's not worth it for you to make that change, then fine. At least you made that decision based on information, and that's up to you. So that's something that I would really recommend for people who are having trouble with that as a sort of a low-hanging fruit place to start. Another one is going back to that regular thing about your phone in bed. I think that if you do that, try and see what happens by not doing it. I think that can both make it hard for you to fall asleep because you've got your brain going at bedtime. And then it can also wake you up because you're sort of rebounding and ruminating. And so I think the phone use in bed feeds both of those things. And that's another really common one that I see with people who I work with, both in clinical practice and in coaching. The caffeine and the alcohol and the phone are probably the two biggest ones, and they contribute to both falling asleep and staying asleep issues.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And it's so funny. It's like people will ask me, what's the medical solution to this? And I'm like, I've been doing this for a long time, and I keep coming back to like these really, really like basic, obvious sounding things. And it's like, did I go to, 14 years of school to like tell you to put your phone down? But yeah, I did.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was a weird day when I realized that like all the nutrition information just leads you to not eat a ton of ultra processed food. It's
yeah, exactly.
Like, oh, cool. I'm glad I've spent a lot of money and time learning that piece of information.
Well, and it goes back to like building the house before you put up the wallpaper. And it's like you probably learned some pretty wallpaper in your nutrition studies too, right? And that's great for people who have a solid house.
Yeah.
But most people don't.
Yeah, 100%.
Myself included.
So not on a fairly regular basis, especially depending on the training cycle. So cool. Anything else you would like to add today?
We covered a lot of ground here, and I think it's been a really useful conversation, and I'm glad that we got to go there. I would say my sort of big takeaway is try things and track how they work. And that applies not just to sleep, it applies to anything else that you might want to do to improve your health. And track it however works best for you. You can use the tools that I have for you. You can use your devices. You can use a plain old piece of paper, just whatever works. And go from there. Study yourself, like be your own subject, and kind of see what works for you.
Love that. And like on the note of some of the tools you've made, like if we wanted to get in touch with you or find some of those tools, where might we do that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. The best place to find me online, you can go to my website. It's flowerpower.health. And I have a page specifically for runners, flowerpower.health/runners. And that's where you can find lots of those tools. I have sleep tools. I have things about injury. I have all kinds of stuff that you might enjoy, and lots of articles. And then you can also find me on Instagram at flowerpower.health, where I put out some fun graphics and a little bit of sass here and there.
Yeah, I appreciate your Instagram quite a bit. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. Hang on for a second. I really am glad you reached out and glad we did this.
Yeah, I am too. It's been really fun chatting with you. It's so funny when you listen to somebody on a podcast a lot. I get used to hearing your voice, and then I feel like I know you and I forget that you don't know me yet, but now we fixed that.
No, I completely know how that goes. I feel like I know so many people, and yet they don't even know I exist. It's one of those very strange things. Well, thanks so much, Elizabeth. Hang out for one sec. Thank you, everybody who listened to this, and we'll be back soon with another one.